let's start with a definition. The virome refers to all the viruses and all their genetic material that reside in our body. And so there are two principles I want you to know, and they're very similar, viruses and bacteria, in this sense. The first principle is that just like bacteria, viruses are everywhere. The second is that just like bacteria, most viruses are friends rather than foe, or at least neutral, okay? Viruses are the most plentiful biological entity in the universe. We have about 10 times as many bacterial cells in our body as human cells, and we have about 10 times as many viral cells as bacterial cells. How many is that? It's a lot. To give you a number, it's somewhere around 380 trillion, which my daughter tells me is more than stars in the universe. I'm not good with those astronomical numbers, but we have a lot, and they are everywhere where there is life on the planet. They are in deserts, they're in oceans. In fact, there are more than 1 million different viruses in one drop of seawater alone. But viruses, as many of you know, are not alive on their own. They're somewhat inanimate. And in order to become animated and come to life, they have to infect a living plant, animal, or bacterial cell, or archaea, which is another kind of microorganism. So they have to infect a living cell. But again, that living cell can be animal, plant, bacterial, or other. And when they infect the cell, they hijack the cellular machinery of the organism. In our case, it's our cells that they're infecting, and they basically direct it to start replicating, churning out multiple copies of itself, and that's called viral replication. Now, here's another really interesting principle. For viruses, replication is a matter of life or death. If they're not replicating, they're not sort of continuing on, right? And they come to an end. It's sort of like with us, natural selection and all these other principles of evolution. We need to be reproducing for the species to go on. Well, the same for viruses, although they're replicating, not reproducing, a little bit different. So viruses have to balance these two competing interests, which is, one is virulence. They want to, infect the host and start churning out copies, and the other, though, is making sure they don't kill the host, because when the host dies, that's the end of them too. So they have to balance virulence and transmission. If a virus is too virulent, it will kill off its host before that host has a chance to transmit the virus to others. If it's not virulent enough, the host may not make enough copies of the virus for it to continue on. And here's the interesting thing. If we look at older viruses like measles virus that have been around a long time, measles has been infecting people for thousands of years. Measles, kind of knows the deal, right? Old broom knows the corners. Measles knows that in order for it to survive, it cannot be too virulent. It also does something interesting. A lot of the symptoms that it induces, and this is not true just for measles, this is true for SARS-CoV-2, for multiple viruses, the symptoms that it creates are designed to transmit it. So when you cough and sneeze, that's designed for you to transmit that virus to someone else. But again, here's a tricky thing. The virus needs to keep you as a host healthy enough that you can be out and about interacting with other people so you can cough and sneeze on them and transmit the virus. I mean, this is all the stuff, this is an evolution of viruses. These are the kinds of things, I don't want to say thinking about, because I'm not sure that that's the appropriate term, but these are the processes that are involved in the evolution of viruses. So they want to keep the host healthy enough to be able to go out there and spread the virus around. So older viruses like measles that have been around for a long time, they know the deal. They're like, yeah, we're going to make you sick, but not so sick that you're not able to go out and infect others. Newer viruses like Ebola, which is a virus that we've just seen in the last 50 years, they're a little bit different. They haven't figured out yet that if they're too virulent, they're going to kill off the host. So their MO, if you will, is to just turn you into a dripping puddle of virions, these viral particles, and hope that you will drip your infectious fluid on somebody and infect them. And Ebola has a very high fatality rate, as you know, about 50%. Now, the interesting thing about Ebola, and this is where we get into the whole concept of health host mattering, right? is that Ebola is only able to infect about 1 in 3 adults it comes into contact with, and a much lower percentage of children. So even though it is very virulent, there are still factors that make 2 out of 3 of people that Ebola comes into contact with somehow resistant to becoming infected. And this is, this is for another day, but this is when we get into host factors. Do you have enough stomach acid to denature the viral protein? Is your gut lining intact? What's going on with your gut microbiome? Is it communicating properly with your immune system? So these are host factors that determine for every 3 people that Ebola comes into contact with, 1 out of 3 it will infect and the other 2 not. But as I said, that's for another day. So again, if we look at a newer virus like Ebola, very virulent, killing almost half the people it infects. And, again, that's not a great long-term strategy, because if you kill off the host can't infect people, but it makes the host so infectious with all the bodily fluids. I mean, you've seen the television footage, right, of people in communities that have been struck by Ebola, and they're wearing these hazmat suits because, body fluids, all the bodily secretions, or essentially most of them, are highly infectious. So that's an example versus measles, not as virulent, but more, keeps the host healthier so they can transmit it around more. So that's an interesting, I find that dynamic between virulence and transmission and that balancing act really interesting. Okay, here's another interesting thing I want you to know about viruses. Not all of them are bad. And in fact, in my new book, The Antiviral Gut, Tackling Pathogens from the Inside Out, which I really hope you will buy. And if you do buy and you enjoy it, please do me a huge favor of leaving a nice rating and review on Amazon. Even if it's a line or a word, I'd so appreciate it. It turns out people really pay attention to those when they're thinking about buying a book. So if you did read it, or you saw me on a podcast and you enjoyed the information, I would be so grateful to you. Okay, so back to this other thing about good versus bad viruses. If you think about bacteria, I mean, we sort of missed the boat there too, right? We were busy super sanitizing and making ourselves super clean, and it turned out that's not such a good idea. We actually need bacteria to digest food, to synthesize vitamins, to train the immune system, to activate genes, to do a whole host of different things, to grow new blood vessels. Well, at the chapter, Welcome to the Virome, in the book, I give a quote from Tony Goldberg, an epidemiologist, and the quote says, "If all viruses were to suddenly disappear, the world would be a great place for about a day and a half, and then we'd all die." Because viruses are involved in some really important homeostatic processes within our own body and also environmentally in terms of maintaining the oceans, the pH, lots of different things. You could find out more about it in the book. But in our own body, viruses are involved in creating placental proteins involved in reproduction and also in encoding memories. And here's an interesting fact that I did not know before I wrote this book. Somewhere between 5 and 10% of our genetic material is actually viral. It is evolved from viruses. And remember, viruses have been infecting us for a long time, since we were around. And what happens is that if a virus infects a cell in the reproductive line, a sperm cell or an ovum, it then gets passed into the genetic material and can get transmitted vertically. It can get passed down to offspring. And that's how it turns out that 5 to 10% of our genetic material is derived from viruses. And again, some of that material is used for important tasks such as encoding memory and making placental proteins. Let me give you another few examples of how viruses can help us. In the lungs, there's a certain type of virus called rhodondovirus, and it turns out that people who have respiratory illnesses, whether that's an infectious illness, inflammatory illness, that rhodondovirus can actually decrease the severity of that illness. And we've seen that with influenza too. So you have an example of one virus that is decreasing virulence of another virus. There is a virus that is a first cousin of dengue fever, and the virus that causes dengue, and that virus delays progression of HIV to AIDS. So somebody who's infected with HIV, if they also are infected with this dengue-like virus, their HIV will progress to AIDS much slower. There is a human herpes virus that in both humans and mice is protective against bubonic plague. Now, bubonic plague is a bacterial illness. It's Yersinia pestis that was infecting the fleas on rats, etc. But again, if you are infected with the human herpes virus, it confers protection against bubonic plague, and that is probably something that developed from over hundreds of years when our ancestors were fighting bubonic plague. So it's really interesting to see how these viruses can actually confer some degree of protection against other things, and there are hundreds more examples, but those were some that I thought were really interesting. Okay, what else can I tell you about viruses? Another important thing is that because they are everywhere in the environment, avoiding exposure is not really a reliable tactic. I mean, obviously, when there's a really bad virus floating around, I mean, if, Ebola, SARS-CoV-2, some of these, we do have to take precautions, as we have all done, wearing masks, hand washing, social distancing, etc. Just an aside, because I love this fact, the word quarantine, that is a word that was derived during the bubonic plague. And remember, that was a bacterial infection, Yersinia pestis, not a virus. But during the bubonic plague, they found that people needed to stay away from other people for about 40 days, 40 in the Italian, and that's where quarantine comes from quarantina, from 40, from the 40 days that it was required for people to avoid contact with other people to avoid spreading the pathogen. So even before they knew that Yersinia pestis was responsible for bubonic plague, they figured out that you needed to isolate, to be in quarantine for a certain period of time. And again, it was 40 days. Okay, so back to viruses. Exposure to some degree is inevitable, as we have seen. And remember that there are many of us who had COVID, we had a positive test, we had symptoms, but for every one person who had a positive test and or symptoms, there are many, many more, maybe as many as 100 times more, 10 times more, 50 times more, we don't really know, who are asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic, who really are sort of unaware. So like most of these pandemics, we will see, and I don't know if we are quite there yet. I mean, these are just approximations because we have no way of knowing, of really testing every single person in the world to see where you exposed, etc. We don't have reliable testing for that, and there's no way from a public health point of view to do that. But the likelihood is that the majority of us in the world at this point have been infected. And so, when you see that the president was infected, the person who was leading COVID preventive strategies was infected. I mean, these are people who ostensibly are taking precautions, maybe not all of them, but you know who I mean. You see that there is a sort of, this is ubiquitous out in the environment. If the people in our country who are the most protected in general have not been able to avoid or evade this. So we see here then that, okay, trying to avoid exposure for a virus like SARS-CoV-2 is not really a reliable strategy. So then we have to look at the next best thing, which is the next best thing is if you are exposed to either be asymptomatic with your infection or mildly asymptomatic and to make a full recovery. And this is where the health of the host matters greatly, right? So we see that people with extremes of age, so the very young, the very old, where the microbiome, the immune system is either still maturing or sort of waning, that these people tend to have a more severe outcome. Sorry, I'm just getting out of the direct sunlight a little bit, even though it's lovely. We see that people who are immunocompromised or taking medications that compromise the immune system are at increased risk. We see people who are lacking stomach acid, mostly because they've suppressed it with a proton pump inhibitor, they're increased risk. We see people who have increased intestinal permeability, where the gut lining is compromised, they're at increased risk for complications, especially in the case of coronavirus, for complications like MIS, multi-system inflammatory syndrome. Okay, I just have to shout out to Dax here. Watched my first video you put out and heard the Jamaican accent peeking out, and it put a huge smile on my face. Yeah, man! Why USA? All right. You know what? We are more than halfway through the half hour, so let me stop talking and make sure I get some comments answered. Available Spanish version of your recent book. It's coming. Thank you so much for asking. Va a venir pronto. No sé exactamente cuándo, pero definitivamente en el año que viene, en 23, va a venir. Okay. When is my book out? My book is out. It came out on November 1st, The Antiviral Gut, Tackling Pathogens from the Inside Out. And for those of you who prefer to listen to a book, I actually read it on Audible, so you'll definitely hear my Jamaican accent peeking out. It was 3 days in the studio. It was really thrilling, just a completely new experience. But the good thing is I knew how to pronounce all the words, so that was easy. Okay, what other questions do we have? Let me roll up to the top here and see. If you haven't sent a question, please do send something in. I have plenty of time. Good morning to you too. And some of these names are terrific. I love your names on Instagram. I used to do this on Zoom, which was great, but I thought it was a little bit easier for people to join on Instagram as opposed to registering for Zoom and joining Zoom there. Okay, so somebody wants to know how much is a book. I'm not sure. I think it's around $20. I'm glad you find this interesting. And let's see what other questions we have. Hi, Sophia. You can get it. Somebody wants to know, you can get it wherever books are sold. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million. You can get it there. Oh, thank you for that. Okay, just joined. Which book was just discussed? So I'm discussing my fourth book, the new one that came out on November 1st, The Antiviral Gut, Tackling Pathogens from the Inside Out. But really, beyond the book, and obviously I think the book is great and I would love it if you all bought it, I'm discussing this whole concept of the Virome, the community of viruses that live in and on our bodies. And for those of you who may have just joined, let me recap and say that we have about 10 times as many bacterial cells as human cells, and we have about 10 times as many viruses as we have bacterial cells. And so that is more than stars in the universe, about 380 trillion. Viruses are everywhere. They are the most common, the most plentiful biological entity on Earth. And they are everywhere from the Sahara Desert to the oceans, etc. More than 1 million viruses in one drop of seawater alone. They are more helpful than harmful. And as a quotation at the beginning of the chapter in the book says, if all viruses disappeared, the world would be a great place for a day and a half, and then we'll all die. Okay. All right, you all must have some questions about viruses. Somebody said they got to hear the Rich Roll podcast, and that's how they found me. Rich Roll is such an amazing person. In addition to being a friend, he had me on 7 years ago with the second book, and we were both speaking at a conference about 8 years ago, and that's how we met. He is just an incredible human being. When I was out in LA taping the podcast, we got to spend some time together beyond the 2.5-hour interview. And, I was just struck by the humility with which he approaches his guests and hosting and everything else. Because sometimes with podcasts, you get the sense like the host is just waiting for you to shut up so they can talk. And they're really not that interested in what you have to say. But Rich is very interested in his guests, and he prepares well. And as I said, despite his podcast being incredibly successful and popular, lots of humility, and I love that. Okay, so I want to get back a little bit while I wait for some questions to roll into this concept of exposure versus infection. And that's something I think that a lot of us haven't really thought about before COVID. So we all know that person at the office or in our community or in our family where everybody's sick, they never get sick. Flu season, flu is raging, that person never gets sick. It's very unlikely that it's because they're not exposed. It's because they have good resistance. So what is it we mean when we talk about resistance? Well, this has to do with this whole concept of terrain theory versus germ theory. So Louis Pasteur, a very eminent French scientist, he popularized the concept of germ theory. And germ theory says a germ, a bad bug, Ebola, SARS-CoV-2, HIV, gets into our body and it makes us sick. And that's absolutely true. And we see examples of that all the time with some of these illnesses, both bacterial and viral. They get into our body, they make us sick. That is absolutely what is happening. But another Frenchman, Antoine Béchamp, at around the same time that Pasteur was popularizing his germ theory, he championed another theory that he called terrain theory. And what Béchamp said is that if our terrain, our soil, and I'm really pointing at my gut here, the gut, okay? So if our soil is healthy, if we have a healthy gut microbiome, healthy gut lining, the germ, the seed, can pass relatively harmlessly through our body without doing much damage. It doesn't mean we're not going to be sick. And I want to emphasize that. The goal is not to not be sick. The goal is to be less sick and to recover. And what we know is that exposure to these germs and childhood illnesses and even, common colds and so on, those things are all training our immune system, okay? So what we know from the hygiene hypothesis is that if we are too clean and we live in a super sanitized environment and we try to avoid exposure to all germs, we set ourselves up for autoimmune disease later on because our immune system hasn't learned how to react appropriately. And then when it sees normal things, like in the case of the diseases I treat, Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis in the gut, it freaks out and it starts to react to normal gut bacteria as pathogens and creates inflammation and so on. So when you don't get enough exposure to germs early on, the end result tends to be overreaction of the immune system, and that's known as autoimmune diseases. So just a little aside there. So to get back to our two Frenchmen, Louis Pasteur and Antoine Béchamp, what Béchamp said again, he said that if you have healthy soil, if your terrain is healthy, the seed will pass relatively harmlessly through. And that is also true because we see these differences in outcome, not just for infection, but really for every disease and disorder. Cancer, infection, heart attack, stroke, autoimmune disease, etc. If you are a healthier person, you are going to have a better outcome. If you are a healthier person and you're in a motor vehicle accident, you're going to have a better outcome. If you are a healthier person and you have cancer, you're going to have a better outcome. And one way that's going to work is they're going to be able to give you more potent chemotherapy that's not going to kill you, because remember, chemotherapy is designed to kill cancer cells. And in that process, it also kills a lot of human cells. And so if you're healthy and more resilient, it means that they can, practically kill you, but you're going to survive and they would have gotten rid of the cancer. So we see this idea that host health matters in every realm of medicine, that to be a healthier host means to be more resilient, to have a better outcome. And in the case of COVID, we're not just talking about acute outcomes, but we're also talking about chronic outcomes, post-viral syndromes. And even though long COVID is a new post-viral syndrome, relatively new, a few years old at this point, we have lots of information from other post-viral syndromes. AIDS is a post-viral chronic syndrome. Hepatitis B and C, chronic hepatitis, those are post-viral syndromes. We know that ME/CFS, formerly known as chronic fatigue syndrome, is in many ways a post-viral syndrome linked to EBV, human herpes virus 6, etc. We think of something like mono, which is related to Epstein-Barr virus, post-viral syndrome, and we also see several autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, and multiple sclerosis, all linked to previous infection with Epstein-Barr virus. So we have a lot of knowledge and experience with these post-viral syndromes. And so even though the virus, SARS-CoV-2, is novel, the science is not for how these post-viral syndromes evolve and develop. And being a healthier host makes a difference there too. I just want to address something. Be very, very clear that when I talk about how to be a healthier host and risk factors like having obesity or having a compromised immune system or not having stomach acid, that in no way am I blaming anybody. If you are taking Nexium every day, I am not blaming you. If you struggle with your weight, I am not blaming you. I'm trying to give you the tools so that you can make more informed decisions about this, so that you could say to your prescriber, hey, this acid blocker you've had me on for 10 years, do I really need it? Because I've gotten some information that's doubling my risk of contracting a viral illness. So could we taper it? What's an alternative? Could I take less of it? So when you have that information, you can be a more informed consumer and a healthier host. And the same thing, you may have struggled with your weight for decades, but now having the information that, wow, this virus is everywhere, and if I get it, I'm likely to have a worse outcome, because with obesity, you can't mechanically ventilate the lungs as well. The adipose tissue is immunologically active in a way that can lead to worse outcome, etc. It may give you a different impetus. what I would love is if it gave our government and our public health system more of an impetus to provide people with the things that we know are helpful, with better access to good food choices, with more time for leisure and exercise, with green spaces for us to play and exercise. So I really see this as not just something that the individual has to pay attention to, but something that I think our entire society needs to pay attention to. We have seen with this virus that we are only as healthy as our least healthy citizen. And so I feel like this is really a collective issue that we need to address to help those in our community who struggle and who are less healthy, and help them to become healthier. And we saw some beautiful examples of that early on in the pandemic, with people bringing food and, just incredible acts of kindness and community. And, those have waned a little bit, but hopefully we'll see more of those. Okay, so I'm gonna check one last time for questions, and then I'm gonna dash, and I apologize that I have to leave a little bit early today. Okay. All right, how would one treat reflux if proton pump inhibitors make you more vulnerable to harmful viruses? I have so much information for you there, Scylla. If you go to the website, robinchutkan.com, sorry, I'm still trying to get out of the sun, and you go to office hours on the tab, you'll see the archived office hours. I've done 2 of them on acid, stomach acid blocking drugs, how to taper off, etc. If you go to the same website, robinchutkan.com, ROBYNNECHUTKAN.com, and you look in the navigation under gut guides, you'll see a whole gut guide to acid reflux, and that includes information for how you can taper off. And if you look in our blog posts and you search acid reflux, you'll find tons of stuff too. So we have a lot of resources there. We got you. Okay. Let's see. Same question. What else besides stopping eating several hours before sleep, small meals, elevating head, healthy weight, and avoiding high acid foods? What meds? Okay. So very important to understand that the class of drugs that put you at increased risk for viral infections and bacterial infections, because you lose stomach acid completely, are proton pump inhibitors, PPIs. So those are drugs like Nexium, omeprazole, Prilosec, Prevacid, Protonix, Acifex. There's a whole bunch of them. And those drugs completely shut down the acid pump in your stomach, the proton potassium ATPase. It's called a proton pump. And so they really, cut stomach acid out completely. It is okay to use a drug like an antacid, like Tums, that you take as needed, or even a histamine blocker, an H2 blocker like Pepcid. Those drugs work on a more as needed basis. So unlike the proton pump inhibitors, which you take every day, these drugs you would take if you overindulge. For example, on Thursday, some of you might be having heartburn, and that might be a time you take it, but they do much less damage because they're not completely blocking the stomach acid. Here are some other things you can do. So you hit some of the really important ones. Stop eating several hours before sleep. Eating earlier in general. Why? Because the stomach has a bedtime. Once the sun sets, stomach contractility drops way down. And that means that stuff is going to sit in your stomach longer. Sorry, I'm still trying to get out of the glare. Stuff is going to sit in your stomach longer, and there's going to be more opportunity for it to reflux up into your esophagus. Okay, so ideally putting about 2 hours between 2 to 3 hours, ideally, between when you eat and when you're reclining. Same thing, when you're lying flat, you don't have the benefit of gravity to slow things down, to help things get through down into your stomach. And you're lying like this, things are more likely to reflux back into the esophagus. Other thing that's really important is the fat content of foods. Foods that have a high fat content are more difficult for our digestive system to digest, and they slow down the emptying of the stomach. They literally, there's a message that gets sent to a part of the stomach called the gastric pacemaker that controls how quickly the stomach contracts. And so when you are eating a meal with a high fat content, that gastric pacemaker is set at a slower rhythm. And so because the stomach is contracting more slowly, it's staying full longer, and there's more opportunity for stuff to reflux back up. So again, you hit some of the big ones on the head. Stop eating before sleep, smaller meals. Your stomach is about this big. When it's full, it's about this big. It's still not a lot. So if you're eating more than a fistful of food at a time, you're probably overwhelming the capacity of your stomach, and stuff is more likely to reflux up. Remember also caffeine, alcohol, and chocolate. Those are 3 things that chemically can open up that lower esophageal sphincter, make things more likely to reflux up. I'm so sorry I have to dash. I literally could hang out with you guys all day. I only wish I could see all of you. And thank you so much for joining me here. This will be reposted later today, maybe tomorrow at the latest. And love hanging out with you, love the questions. Please send me more questions, send me comments, tell me what you want to hear about. Antibiotics coming back up. Buy the book, The Antiviral Gut. Leave me a little quick rating or review if you have the time, and have a wonderful, wonderful Thanksgiving, everyone.